Okay, so here is a little crash course review of the Cold War and things that you have done so far. And this one should not be that long, and all of this stuff should be review. I just wanted you to have something for a reference as we move forward. Okay, so the Cold War, you see here from the slides here, we have two different flags. Hopefully you recognize these flags. The first on the top left is the United States, and the bottom right with the hammer and the sickle is the Soviet Union. Okay, and these are the two main players in the Cold War, although there are a number of other countries that are involved with this. So the heart of this conflict and the reason this conflict lasts for as long as it does, and you should know that the war started in 45, ends in 1991. The heart of this conflict is political and economic ideologies. And ideologies just means a belief system, your political belief, your economic beliefs. Okay? So we have a little bit of an overview here. I'm not sure if Mrs. Day went through what exactly capitalism and communism and socialism are, but just to have a spectrum, these are economic ideologies. These are economic theories, and different countries use different variations of these economic systems. And really going back to right around the time of the American Revolution, most countries in the world were looking at capitalism. And that's generally what our economy is today. But then there's this guy here. I think he looks like Santa Claus a little bit, but his name is Karl Marx. And he wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. And in that book, he basically said that capitalism was bad. Capitalism would lead to the destruction of society because there are people that are able to make money, and there's people that are able to get good jobs, and that's wonderful. But a lot of people in the world are struggling. They don't have a job. They don't have as much money. They're the have-nots. And he came up with this idea of communism. And this idea of communism is basically like a utopian society where everybody would be equal. There would be no government, there would be no money, there would be no taxes. Everybody would work for the benefit of everybody else. Um, Almost like going back to the early years of bartering, right? You know, some people in your community would take care of others, and some would grow corn, and some would, sew clothes, and everybody would do everything for everybody else. Karl Marx realized that people aren't just going to give up all their stuff that they have in capitalism, all their money, all their belongings, their private property, and just give it up to the community. So he came up with this idea of socialism, where the government would take over. And the government would basically take everything from the individual people and plan it out and then rationally distribute it back to the community, and then they would dissolve themselves. They would go away. Remember, communism, no government. So this was a great idea in theory. And I'm hoping that in your minds, one of the things you're saying is, but we still have government and we still have communism. So where's the disconnect? Where does the story take a turn? And what ends up happening is as countries like the Soviet Union, who was the first country to sort of experiment with this, nobody ever actually gets to hear. Okay? All of the so-called communist countries in the world are really a very extreme socialism where you have authoritarian governments and leaders making all kinds of decisions with no incentive and no individualism that we value here in the United States. So we've never actually had a true communist society. We don't know if it would ever work because we've never had it. But what we're really looking at here in the Cold War is this idea of socialism versus capitalism under that umbrella term of communism. Okay? So again, these are really economic theories. And in theory, like I said, communism should be no government, no markets, no competition, everybody is equal, no taxes, none of that stuff. And with capitalism, think about our own society. We own property. We have a market economy. We have a democratic government. It's based on the people. We have a lot of competition and supply and demand. Um, Supply and demand, if you're unfamiliar, I mean, the best example would be toilet paper during this pandemic. If you were to go online onto Amazon to try to buy toilet paper, it might cost $50 for a roll. The demand for toilet paper is very high. A lot of people want toilet paper in these times. I don't know why, but they do. Um, but the supply of said toilet paper is very low, so that causes the prices to go up. But as supply and demand balance each other out, as times change, the prices are adjusting. And that's really a hallmark of, of capitalism. But in reality, this is what we're dealing with. Okay, capitalism is pretty much the same. We have our private property, we have our market-based economy, we do have a democratic government. The only difference between the theory and reality is that we do have some government regulation in the economy, and you learned about this with the Great Depression or the stock market crash and things like that. Without government regulation, it can go crazy. Okay, so there is some government regulation to protect the individual. But the communism that we look at during this time is basically authoritarians and dictatorships, thinking of the Soviet Union, thinking of China, thinking of North Korea. There is no market system. We call this a command economy, meaning that the government controls every aspect of the economy. There's no individual competition like there is in a capitalist society, and it's more of a focus on societal success as opposed to individual success. The American dream for the United States is you work hard, you do well, you succeed for yourself and your family. That's individual incentive. Communism does not have individual incentive. It's more about the society and more about, accomplishing your goals for what's best in society. So going into what a Cold War is here, a Cold War, like we said, is a war between the United States and the Soviet Union from 45 to 91. And we say that it is a Cold War of ideologies because we in the United States have this idea of free markets and just freedoms in general being democratic, while we look at communism as being bad because they are dictatorships and controlling and not allowing that free enterprise. Okay, so some of the things that you talked about, let me go back for a second. You're letting me? Okay. One of the things that you talked about with Mrs. Day was probably the mutual distrust and things like that. Another big part that you talked about, and I know that you did this because I saw the maps that you colored. Mrs. Day still had it on her board, is the Iron Curtain. And the Iron Curtain is basically a political boundary. It is not an actual border. It is not an actual Iron Curtain. It is a political boundary that separates what we believe as being right and what they believe as being wrong. Okay, so it's that separation of communism and non-communism and capitalism versus command economy. Okay. The reason in the bottom right-hand corner there, I have a picture of Winston Churchill. He's the one that kind of coined this phrase of Iron Curtain in response to Joseph Stalin saying that communism was going to take over the world. So that's where we get. And here's the map that you colored, or a map that you've seen. That dark red there on the far right is the Soviet Union. All of the colors that all of the countries that you see in gray are countries that are outside the Iron Curtain. When we use that language, beyond the Iron Curtain, outside the Iron Curtain, they are free, they are democratic, they are capitalist at this point in time, circa 1945. The countries that you see there in pink are what you should have learned as satellite nations, or Joseph Stalin's buffer zone. Those countries are communist, but they are under the control of the Soviet Union, and at the time, Joseph Stalin. Okay, so some of the things that you talked about with the Cold War in Europe, notice that the first three things are 1945, Yalta, Potsdam conferences, and the formation of the United Nations, all happening simultaneously with the end of World War II. In the Yalta Conference and Potsdam Conference, they talked about the separation of Germany into quadrants and then eventually into halves. They talk about what to do with Poland. Should Poland be a free country, or should Poland be allowed to be communist, or should they vote, give the people a decision? The Potsdam Conference, that's where Harry Truman basically shares with Joseph Stalin and the rest of the world that he does have an atomic bomb that he's considering using on Japan. And then the formation of the UN was something that actually came out at the Yalta Conference. These first two events, really, the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, are really the beginning of the Cold War, because it's showing how the United States and the Soviet Union have two very different views of what the post-World War II world should look like. Which leads me into my next point, conflicting post-war goals. The United States became sort of like the big brother country of the world. And they were basically, the baton was passed to them from Great Britain. You know, you are in charge, the world needs you guys, basically, is what they were told. And they had this vision of countries being free and being democratic and being capitalist and allowing trade and openness and transparency between the countries to help all of us succeed. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union had a very different view. They predicted the triumph of communism. They believed that capitalism was evil and that it was capitalism that led to the Great Crash and the Great Depression of the 1930s. And then because of the Great Depression, ultimately World War II. So he predicted that communism should and would take over. He also had conflicting goal, or a conflicting goal from us. Another goal was that he would never be embarrassed again by a Western power. Hopefully you remember from World War II how Hitler and Stalin had this agreement not to invade each other. And Hitler basically said, yeah, don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. And Joseph Stalin was caught off guard. And he created those buffer zones, those satellite nations, to protect his country. He never wanted to be embarrassed by a Western power again. So very different points of view. And then the last thing you talked about with the Cold War in Europe, and I am just noticing now I did not capitalize war at the top of my PowerPoint, whoops, but the policy of containment. And that's very, very, very important. If there's anything in this review PowerPoint that is important for moving forward, it is the policy of containment. The policy of containment says that the United States would do anything in their power to stop the spread of communism outside of Europe, and that's the key. Okay, those countries that have already fallen, and I'm going to move on to the next slide for a second here. These countries here, okay, these countries, these satellite nations that you see here in pink, those countries, they have already fallen. They're already behind the Iron Curtain, again, using the language. So there's nothing that we can do about those countries. Because if we try to go in and save those countries, it becomes a hot war, and we don't want that. We just got out of World War II. So the idea of the policy of containment is to save Greece and Turkey, which you talked about in the Truman Doctrine. Okay, Greece and Turkey were being threatened politically, militarily, economically, and the Truman Doctrine, President Truman, our Congress gave $400 million to protect Greece and Turkey, and they did. You learned about the Marshall Plan, where you have all of these Western European nations trying to rebuild after World War II. And because they are in a state of political and economic chaos, many of them, it becomes a breeding ground for communism. And so the Marshall Plan is basically the same thing as the Truman Doctrine, just on a much larger scale. The United States provided $13 billion in aid to help these countries rebuild after the war so that they could protect themselves. And they did. Then you talked about the Berlin airlift with Germany, and that's basically just an extension of the Marshall Plan, but to save West Berlin. Okay, so we're doing all of these things to stop the spread of communism outside of Europe. Okay, there's nothing that we can do about these countries. Okay, they're gone. They're already fallen. But the policy of containment is, can we save these guys? Can we help everybody else? And in Europe, it works. Okay. Okay, so one of the other things that you talked about with the Cold War in Europe was NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And that's basically just a military alliance, if you want to call it that, where an attack on one country is an attack on all. And that's the idea of nobody wants a World War III, because if you think about it, by the time we get into 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, we have atomic weapons. The United States has them, the Soviet Union will get them. And so a World War III would turn into a nuclear World War III, and nobody wanted that. So both sides, our side and their side, came up with this alliance, which if you look at the map, these are pretty much all of the countries that are behind the Iron Curtain, and these are the countries that are outside the Iron Curtain, pretty much. Okay, so it's just a way to protect each other from another war. This is the last slide of the review PowerPoint. I hope this stuff was familiar to you. There's going to be another PowerPoint dealing specifically with Asia, and that's going to be all new. So I'm going to strongly encourage you to pay attention to that one and to save the PowerPoint.